On a frozen battlefield in 1914, enemies stopped shooting and began singing to one another. In a small Austrian village, a priest with a broken church organ picked up a guitar and performed a song that would echo across centuries. Across the Atlantic, a general led his starving army through ice and sleet on Christmas night, gambling everything on one desperate attack. And far above the earth, 3 astronauts floated in the darkness of space, reading ancient words to a watching world below. These moments did not happen in the same year. They did not happen in the same country. Some occurred during war, others during peace. Some involved famous figures, others ordinary people whose names would only be remembered later. Yet each of these events shares something quiet and remarkable. They all happened at Christmas, and they all carry a gentleness that has allowed them to endure. Tonight, we will journey through 5 such stories. They span nearly 200 years of history, crossing oceans and even leaving Earth itself. But despite their differences, they belong together. Each one offers the same quiet invitation to pause, to wonder, and to remember that even in the coldest and darkest times, humanity has found ways to create light. These are not stories meant to alarm or excite. They are stories meant to rest with. Let them wash over you slowly, like snowfall on a winter evening. Let the past become a companion as the night grows still, and perhaps, by the time the last story ends, sleep will have already found you. Christmas has held a special place in human history for nearly 2,000 years, but the holiday we know today, with its trees and carols, its gifts and gatherings, is not quite the same celebration that existed centuries ago. Like all traditions, Christmas has grown and changed over time, shaped by the people who observed it and the events that surrounded it. The earliest Christmas celebrations were simple religious observances. In the 4th century, Christian churches began marking December 25th as the birth of Jesus Christ. Scholars still debate whether this date was chosen for theological reasons or because it fell near the winter solstice, a time already sacred to many ancient cultures. The Romans celebrated Saturnalia in late December, a festival of feasting and gift-giving. Northern European peoples marked the solstice with Yule traditions, burning logs, decorating with evergreens, and gathering to wait out the longest nights of the year. When Christianity spread across Europe, these older customs did not disappear. Instead, they blended with the new faith, creating a holiday that carried echoes of many traditions. For centuries, Christmas remained primarily a religious occasion. Churches held special mass, families attended services, and shared modest meals. In some times and places, the celebration was quiet and restrained. In others, it was loud and festive, lasting for days or even weeks. The Puritans in England and early America actually banned Christmas for a time, viewing its merriment as inappropriate. But the holiday always returned. There was something about this moment in the calendar, the darkest time of year, when the sun seemed weakest and the night stretched long, that called for light, warmth, and gathering. By the 19th century, Christmas began to transform into something closer to what we recognize today. Writers like Charles Dickens, with his famous story, A Christmas Carol, helped shape the idea of Christmas as a time for generosity, family, and reflection. New traditions emerged: Christmas cards, department store santees, and elaborately decorated trees. The industrial age made gifts more affordable and travel more possible. Families who had scattered to cities could return to their childhood homes. Christmas became not just a holy day, but a homecoming. And through all of this, Christmas developed a curious power in human affairs. It became a day when ordinary rules seemed to bend. Truces were called. Kindnesses were extended. Strangers smiled at one another, even in the midst of conflict or hardship. Something about December 25th encouraged people to pause, if only briefly, and remember their gentler instincts. This is not mere sentimentality. History records genuine moments when Christmas changed the course of events, when decisions made on this day altered what came after. It is this quality that makes Christmas stories so enduring. They are not simply tales of what happened long ago. They are reminders of what is possible when humanity chooses, even for a moment, to set aside its struggles and reach toward something kinder. The stories that survive across generations are rarely chosen by accident. Something in them speaks to needs that do not change, No matter how much the world around us shifts, Christmas stories, in particular, seem to carry a special weight. Perhaps this is because they arrive at the right moment, the deep of winter, when the world outside is cold and the hours of darkness are long. In ancient times, before electricity and central heating, winter was a season of genuine hardship. Food supplies dwindled. Travel became difficult or impossible. People stayed close to home, huddled near fires, waiting for the sun to return. In this context, a celebration of light and hope was not merely pleasant, it was necessary. The winter solstice marked the turning point, the promise that days would soon grow longer again. Christmas, falling just after the solstice, carried this promise forward. It said, "The darkness will not last forever. Hold on, light is coming." This emotional resonance has never fully faded. Even now, when most of us live with artificial light and heated homes, winter still feels like a time for turning inward. The holidays still bring a particular kind of longing, for family, for warmth, for meaning. And the stories we tell at Christmas still tend to circle around these themes. They speak of hope against odds. They speak of kindness, offered when it was least expected. They speak of ordinary moments becoming extraordinary because of when they happened and what they meant. There's also something about Christmas that invites storytelling itself. The holiday has always been a time for gathering around tables, around fires, around trees, and where people gather, stories follow. Parents tell children about Christmases past. Grandparents share memories of traditions now forgotten. Communities remember events that defined them. The act of telling these stories becomes part of the celebration, a ritual as meaningful as any gift or feast. Over time, some of these stories grow beyond the families and communities that first told them. They spread across regions, then across nations, then across the world. They become part of a shared human inheritance. Tales that belong to everyone because they speak to something everyone understands. The 5 stories we will explore tonight have all made this journey. They began as specific events, witnessed by specific people in specific places, but they did not stay there. They traveled outward, carried by letters and newspapers, by songs and paintings, by radio and television. Today, they belong to the world. And perhaps this is fitting. Christmas itself has become a global occasion, observed in nearly every country on Earth, by people of many faiths and no faith at all. The stories that have attached themselves to this holiday carry a similar universality. They are not only about Christians or Europeans or Americans. They are about human beings. What we hope for, what we fear, what we are capable of when we are at our best. The 5 stories gathered here are very different from one another. They come from different centuries, different countries, different circumstances. One unfolds on a battlefield. One takes place in a tiny church. One centers on a royal family. One follows a desperate army. One reaches beyond our planet entirely. Yet despite these differences, each story shares a common quality, a sense of quiet wonder, of something gentle emerging from something difficult. The first story takes us to the Western Front in December 1914. The First World War had begun just months earlier, and already it had become a nightmare beyond imagining. Millions of young men faced each other across muddy trenches, separated by a narrow strip of devastated ground called no man's land. Death came daily, randomly, without meaning, and yet, on Christmas Eve, something unexpected happened. German soldiers began decorating their trenches with candles and small trees. They began singing carols, and slowly, cautiously, their enemies began to sing back. What followed was one of the most remarkable events in military history, a spontaneous truce born not from generals' orders but from ordinary soldiers longing for peace. For a few hours, enemies became something like friends. They shared cigarettes and photographs. They buried their dead together. They played football in the frozen mud. And then, because the war demanded it, they returned to their trenches and resumed killing each other. But they never forgot what had happened. Neither has history. The second story is quieter, but its reach has been even greater. In 1818, in a small Austrian village called Oberndorf, a young priest named Joseph Mohr faced a problem. Christmas Eve was approaching, and the church organ was broken. Without music, the midnight mass would feel incomplete. Moore had written a poem sometime before, a simple, gentle reflection on the Nativity. He brought it to the local school teacher, Franz Egver Gruber, and asked if he could compose a melody that could be played on guitar. Gruber agreed. That night, in a modest church filled with villagers, the two men performed their new song for the first time. They called it Stille Nacht, Silent Night. Neither man could have imagined what would follow. The song spread slowly at first, carried by traveling singers through the Alps. Then it crossed borders. It was translated into dozens of languages. It was sung in cathedrals and living rooms, in trenches and hospitals, in places its creators never knew existed. Today, it is the most recorded Christmas song in history, and it began with a broken organ and a priest who refused to let the silence win. The third story moves to England, to the 1840s, and to the most famous family in the world at that time. Queen Victoria had recently married Prince Albert, a German prince from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert brought with him many memories of his German childhood, including one tradition that was largely unknown in Britain: the Christmas tree. In Germany, families had been decorating evergreen trees for centuries, adorning them with candles, fruits, and small ornaments. Albert introduced this custom to the royal household, and soon a tree stood in Windsor Castle each December. In 1848, a newspaper published an illustration of the royal family gathered around their decorated tree. The image captured the public's imagination. Wheat and jeers, Christmas trees, appeared in homes across Britain. The tradition crossed the Atlantic to America. It spread throughout the British Empire. Today, the Christmas tree is one of the most universal symbols of the holiday, and it owes much of its popularity to a German prince who simply wanted to share a piece of his childhood with his new family. The fourth story takes us back further in time, to the winter of 1776, and to a nation that did not yet fully exist. The American Revolution was going badly. George Washington's Continental Army had suffered defeat after defeat. Soldiers were deserting. Supplies were gone. Enlistments were expiring. By Christmas, it seemed possible that the army might simply melt away, and with it, the dream of American independence. Washington made a desperate decision. On Christmas night, he would lead his remaining troops across the icy Delaware River and launch a surprise attack on Hessian forces garrisoned at Trenton, New Jersey. The plan was risky beyond reason. The weather was brutal. Freezing rain, sleet, ice floes choking the river. But Washington believed that the enemy would not expect an attack on Christmas. It was right. The crossing took all night, but the army made it. The attack succeeded. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. American casualties were minimal. The victory was small in military terms, but its psychological impact was immense. The revolution would continue. A nation would be born, and it happened because one general chose Christmas night to gamble everything. The fifth and final story reaches beyond Earth itself. In December 1968, the world was in turmoil. The Vietnam War raged. Assassinations had claimed Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Cities had burned in riots. It was one of the most painful years in American memory. And yet, in the final days of that year, something remarkable happened. 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, became the first human beings to leave Earth's orbit and travel to the moon. On Christmas Eve, as their spacecraft circled the lunar surface, they turned a camera toward home. What they saw, and what they shared with a watching world, was the Earth rising over the moon's horizon, a small, fragile, blue and white marble floating in the blackness of space. That image, known as Earthrise, would change how humanity saw itself. And that night, the astronauts read from the book of Genesis to an audience of nearly 1 billion people. It was a Christmas message from the heavens, offered to a world that desperately needed a moment of peace. These 5 stories do not form a single narrative. They are separated by time and space, by language and circumstance. The soldiers in the trenches did not know about Washington's crossing. The priest in Austria never dreamed that men would one day orbit the moon. Queen Victoria could not have imagined the wars that would come after her reign. Each story stands on its own, complete and self-contained. And yet, something connects them. In each case, Christmas served as a catalyst, a moment when ordinary rules bent, when unexpected things became possible. The truce happened because it was Christmas. The song was written because Christmas Eve demanded music. The tree spread because families wanted to celebrate like royalty. The crossing succeeded because the enemy did not expect an attack on a holy night. The broadcast moved the world because it arrived on Christmas Eve, when hearts were open. There is also this Ineach story. The people at the center were not so different from us. They were cold, or tired, or afraid, or simply doing their jobs. They did not know they were making history. They only knew that it was Christmas, and that the moment called for something, a song, a gesture, a risk, a message. They answered that call, and because they did, we remember them. These are stories meant to comfort, not to challenge. They carry no great moral demands. They ask nothing of you except to listen, to rest, and perhaps to remember that even in the darkest times, light has been found before. It will be found again. Let us begin with a story that emerged from the most unlikely of places. The muddy, frozen trenches of the First World War, where enemies put down their weapons and, for a few precious hours, remembered that they were all simply human beings, far from home, longing for peace. When the First World War began in August 1914, almost everyone believed it would be brief. Soldiers marching off to battle told their families they would be home by Christmas. Politicians and generals spoke confidently of quick victories. The nations of Europe had not fought a major war in decades, and few understood what modern weapons would do to human bodies, or what kind of conflict was truly beginning. By December, those early predictions had proven terribly wrong. The war that was supposed to end in weeks had settled into a nightmare that would last for years and claim millions of lives. On the Western Front, a line of trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, nearly 500 miles of mud, barbed wire, and death. British and French forces faced German forces across a narrow strip of devastated ground called No Man's Land. In some places, the enemy trenches were only 50 yards apart, close enough to hear voices, close enough to smell cooking fires, close enough, as it turned out, to hear Christmas carols. The trenches themselves were miserable beyond description. Rain turned the ground to thick, clinging mud. Water collected in the bottom of the trenches, sometimes needy. Rats thrived, grown fat on what war provided them. Disease spread easily. Soldiers lived in constant fear of artillery shells, sniper fire, and the order to go over the top, to climb out of the relative safety of the trench and charge across No Man's Land. Toward most who made that charge did not survive it. By Christmas 1914, the soldiers on both sides were exhausted, cold, and homesick. Many had not expected to still be fighting. Some had not expected to still be alive. The holiday approaching felt like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost: warm homes, loving families, the ordinary peace of civilian life. And yet, something was about to happen that no general had ordered and no politician had planned. The first signs appeared on the German side. On the evening of December 24th, British soldiers peering over their parapets noticed something strange in the enemy trenches. Small lights were appearing along the German line. Candles placed on the edges of the trenches and on small trees that had been brought up from somewhere behind the lines. The effect was startling. The battlefield, usually so dark and threatening, began to glow softly. Then came the singing. German voices rose in the cold night air, carrying a melody that many British soldiers recognized even before they understood the words. Stillness, heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night. man's land. Fragile and strange in that place of death. For a moment, the British soldiers simply listened. Then, tentatively, some of them began to sing back. "O come, all the faithful." The first, Noel. Songs they had learned in churches and schools back home, offered now to enemies they had been trying to kill just hours before. Shouts began to cross the darkness. "Merry Christmas, Englishmen," came from the German trenches. "Merry Christmas, Fritz," came the reply. Fritz was a common nickname British soldiers used for their German counterparts. There was something almost absurd about it. Men who had been shooting at each other now, calling out holiday greetings like neighbors across a fence. In some sectors, the singing continued for hours. Soldiers added harmonies. They applauded each other's songs. When one side finished a carol, the other side would begin another. The officers, many of whom would later face consequences for allowing what happened next, seemed uncertain how to respond. Some ordered their men to stop. Others let it continue. A few even joined in. As midnight approached, the firing that normally punctuated the night fell silent. The big guns stopped. The rifles stopped. The machine guns stopped. Along miles of the front, an unofficial ceasefire took hold, not ordered by any commander, but simply agreed upon by the men who would have to do the fighting and dying. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold. In Mani, places a light frost. Cavet, the ground. And then, in one of the most remarkable scenes in military history, soldiers began to climb out of their trenches. The first to emerge were cautious, unarmed, hands visible. They walked slowly into no man's land, that terrible strip of earth that had claimed so many lives. From the other side, enemy soldiers did the same. They met in the middle, British and German, enemies by nationality, but suddenly, strangely, something like friends. The scenes that followed varied from sector to sector, but certain elements appeared again and again. Soldiers shook hands. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons from uniforms, small personal items that could be carried as souvenirs. They shared photographs of their families, wives, children, parents, faces that made it clear these were not monsters, but ordinary men, caught up in something far larger than themselves. Language was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Some German soldiers had worked in Britain before the war and spoke English. Some British soldiers knew a little German. Others communicated with gestures, smiles, and the universal language of shared humanity. They pointed at photographs and said names. They offered food and drink. They laughed together at jokes that might not have made sense, but did not need to. There were also practical matters to attend to. In the chaos of the previous months, many bodies had been left in no man's land, impossible to retrieve under fire. Now, both sides worked together to bury their dead. Joint funeral services were held. Prayers were spoken in two languages over graves dug in shared ground. For men who had seen so much death, this was perhaps the most meaningful part of the truce, the chance to honor fallen comrades with dignity. And then there were the football matches. Reports of soldiers playing football, soccer, in no man's land have become one of the most famous images of the Christmas truce. The evidence for these matches is mixed. Some definitely occurred, though they were informal affairs, often played with improvised balls or bundles of rags. Others may have been exaggerated in later but the image endures because it captures something essential about what happened that day. Men who should have been killing each other chose instead to play a game together. They chose life over death, if only for a few hours. The truce could not last. By late afternoon on Christmas Day, officers on both sides began ordering their men back to the trenches. The war had not ended. The commands from above had not changed. Whatever had happened in no man's land, it could not be allowed to continue. Some soldiers exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. Some shook hands one final time before turning back toward their own lines. A few struggled to leave it all, reluctant to return to a world where these newfound friends would once again be targets. In some sectors, the informal ceasefire extended through December 26th, even into the new year. In others, fighting resumed on Christmas night. The transition was painful. Men who had shared cigarettes and photographs in the morning were expected to shoot at each other by evening. Many found it difficult. Some refused, at least for a time. Letters home from the period describe the strangeness of the experience, the feeling that something profound had happened. Something that should have changed everything but somehow did not. The military authorities were not pleased. As news of the truce spread, commanders worried about its effect on discipline and morale. If soldiers could see the enemy as human beings, how could they be expected to kill them? Orders were issued to prevent any future fraternization. In subsequent years, artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas Eve, specifically to prevent another truce from forming. The war continued for 4 more years, claiming millions more lives. Nothing like the Christmas truce of 1914 ever happened again. For many years after the war ended, the Christmas truce was not widely discussed. It did not fit the official narrative of noble sacrifice and righteous victory. Veterans who had participated sometimes spoke of it privately, but it received little public attention. The truce seemed almost embarrassing. A moment when the machinery of war had briefly broken down, when ordinary human feeling had overridden military discipline. But memories have a way of surviving. In the decades that followed, letters and diaries from the truce emerged. Historians began to piece together what had happened. By the late 20th century, the Christmas truce had been transformed from a forgotten footnote into a powerful symbol. Proof that even in the worst circumstances, human beings retain the capacity for peace. Today, memorials mark the sites where the truce occurred. Songs have been written about it. Films have depicted it. Each December, people around the world remember the night when enemies sang carols to each other across the darkness of no man's land. The song most often associated with that night, the melody that first drifted across the frozen battlefield, was Silent Night and Song. As It Happens has a remarkable story of its own. It begins not in a trench, but in a small village church in Austria, 100 years earlier, where a priest faced a simple problem and found an extraordinary solution. In the early 19th century, the village of Oberndorf bei Salzburg was a quiet place, home to perhaps 1,000 souls. It sat along the Salzach River, not far from the city of Salzburg, in a region of Austria known for its mountains, its music, and its deep Catholic faith. The villagers were mostly working people, boatmen who transported salt along the river, craftsmen, farmers, and shopkeepers. Their lives followed rhythms that had not changed for generations. They worked. They prayed. They gathered in the modest church of St. Nicholas for Massas and holy days. And each year, as December darkened the Alpine valleys, they prepared to celebrate Christmas. The year 1818 found Europe still recovering from decades of war. Napoleon had finally been defeated just 3 years earlier, but the scars of his campaigns remained. Borders had shifted. Economies had been disrupted. Families had lost sons to distant battlefields. In villages like Oberndorf, people were trying to rebuild ordinary lives after years of uncertainty. Christmas that year carried a special weight, a chance to gather, to give thanks for peace, and to hope that the hardships were finally ending. The Church of St. Nicholas was the heart of the community's religious life. It was not a grand cathedral, but a simple parish church, adequate for the village's needs. Inside, wooden pews faced a modest altar. Candles provided light during evening services. And like many churches of the era, St. Nicholas possessed an organ, a vital instrument for leading hymns and creating the atmosphere of sacred worship. Without the organ, masses felt incomplete. The music lifted the congregation's voices and spirits. It transformed ordinary prayer into something transcendent. As Christmas Eve 1818 approached, the assistant priest of St. Nicholas faced a problem that threatened to silence the music entirely. Joseph Moore was 26 years old in December 1818. He had been born in Salzburg. Under difficult circumstances, his father had abandoned the family before Joseph's birth, and his mother struggled to provide for her children. Despite these hardships, young Joseph showed promise. A local church official recognized his intelligence and arranged for his education. Moore studied theology, was ordained as a priest in 1815, and was eventually assigned to Oberndorf as assistant to the aging pastor of St. Nicholas. Moore was known as a kind and dedicated priest, popular with his parishioners. He had a gift for connecting with ordinary people and understanding their struggles. He also had a talent that set him apart from many of his fellow clergy. He played the guitar, In an era when church music meant organs and choirs, the guitar was an unusual instrument for a priest to favor. But Moore had learned it in his youth, and he never abandoned it. In the days before Christmas, 1818, Moore discovered that the church organ was broken. The exact cause has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. Some accounts blame mice, which had chewed through the leather bellows. Others suggest rust or water damage from the damp river air. A few stories claimed the organ had simply worn out from age and use. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The organ could not be played. Christmas Eve was approaching, and the midnight mass would have no music. For many priests, this would have been a minor inconvenience. The mass could proceed without him. The congregation would understand. But Moore was not willing to accept a silent Christmas. He remembered a poem he had written 2 years earlier, in 1816, while serving at a different parish. It was a simple reflection on the Nativity, the Holy Night, the sleeping infant, the peace that descended on Bethlehem. He had titled it Still Natt, Elid Natt, Silent Night, Holy Night. Moore retrieved the poem and considered its possibilities. If he could find someone to set it to music. Simple music. Music that could be played on a guitar. Perhaps Christmas Eve would have its song after all. The harmonies were simple enough for guitar accompaniment, but beautiful enough to touch the heart. That night, as the villagers of Oberndorf gathered in St. Nicholas Church for midnight mass, they heard something new. Father Moore stood before them with his guitar. Beside him stood Franz Gruber, Riadi to sing. Together, they performed Still Natt for the first time. Moore playing the guitar and singing tenor, Gruber singing bass. The congregation listened in silence. When the song ended, there was no applause. This was a church, after all. But something had shifted in the room. The candlelight seemed warmer. The holy night felt closer. Neither Moore nor Gruber could have known what they had created. To them, it was simply a solution to a problem, a way to bring music to Christmas Eve when the organ had failed. The song had served its purpose. Mass continued. The villagers went home to their families, and Still Natt might have been forgotten entirely. Just another hymn sung once and never again. But that is not what happened. In the years following that first performance, Silent Night began a journey that would carry it far beyond the small church where it was born. The path was slow at first, moving through the Austrian countryside by means that seem almost accidental. The organ at St. Nicholas was eventually repaired by a craftsman named Karl Moore. While working on the instrument, Maracker heard the song and was charmed by it. He carried the melody back to his home in the Zillertal, a valley known for its folk music and traveling singers. There, Still Natt was picked up by family singing groups who wandered through Austria and Germany, performing at fairs and markets to earn their living. 2 families in particular. The Strasser family and the Rainer family included the song in their repertoires. They performed it in cities across Europe, introducing it to audiences who had never heard of Oberndorf or its modest church. The Rainer singers even traveled to America, performing Still Natt for audiences in New York in the 1830s. Slowly, the song began to spread. As it traveled. The song was translated. An Episcopal priest named John Freeman Young published an English version in 1859, giving the world the lyrics we know today. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Other translations followed. French, Spanish, Italian, and eventually dozens more. Each translation carried the song into new communities, new churches, new homes. By the end of the 19th century, Silent Night had become one of the most beloved Christmas carols in the world. It was sung in cathedrals and country churches, in concert halls and living rooms. Soldiers sang it in wartime. Families sang it around Christmas trees. It crossed borders and oceans, carrying its message of peace wherever it went. The song's fame only grew in the 20th century. It was one of the first songs ever broadcast on radio. It has been recorded by countless artists in every musical style imaginable. Today, scholars estimate that Silent Night is the most recorded Christmas song in history, with versions in over 300 languages. It has been declared an intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO, a recognition of its extraordinary impact on human culture. And it all began with a broken organ and a priest who would not accept silence. Joseph Mohr and Franz Xaver Gruber never became famous in their lifetimes. They never earned money from their creation. They simply continued their quiet work, Mohr as a priest, Gruber as a teacher and musician, while their song traveled the world without them. Mohr spent the rest of his career serving small parishes in the Austrian countryside. He was known for his generosity, often giving his own money and possessions to the poor. He never married, as his vows required, and he never accumulated wealth. When he died in 1848, at the age of 55, he left almost nothing behind, except for a song that had already outlived him. Gruber lived longer, dying in 1863 at the age of 76. He continued composing music throughout his life, producing dozens of works for church and community. But none of his other compositions achieved lasting fame. Only Silent Night survived, growing more beloved with each passing year. In his final years, Gruber wrote down the story of the song's creation, wanting to set the record straight. For a time, the song had been attributed to more famous composers: Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. Gruber's account confirmed what really happened to ordinary men in an ordinary village, creating something extraordinary because Christmas Eve demanded it. Today, the original Church of St. Nicholas no longer stands. It was demolished in the early 20th century due to flooding damage. But a small chapel, the Silent Night Chapel, was built on the site to commemorate the song's birthplace. Each year, visitors from around the world come to Oberndorf to see where it all began. They stand in the quiet chapel and imagine that Christmas Eve in 1818, the guitar, the voices of two men offering a simple song to a small congregation. The song those visitors carry in their hearts is the same one that drifted across no man's land in 1914, sung by German soldiers to their British enemies. It is the same one that families sing around Christmas trees in homes across the globe. And those Christmas trees, as it happens, have their own story, one that begins not in Austria, but in the drawing rooms of British royalty. In the early 19th century, British Christmas celebrations looked quite different from what we know today. The holiday was observed, certainly, but it lacked many of the traditions that now seem inseparable from the season. Families gathered for meals. Churches held special services. Some homes were decorated with holly, ivy, and mistletoe, greenery that had been part of winter celebrations since ancient times. But the centerpiece of the modern Christmas, the decorated evergreen tree, glowing with lights and laden with ornaments, was virtually unknown in British homes. The British Christmas of that era was a more modest affair than it would later become. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the country, drawing people from villages into crowded cities, changing the rhythms of work and family life. Christmas provided a welcome pause in the factory calendar, a day when workers could rest and families could reunite. But the elaborate celebrations we associate with the Victorian era had not yet developed. Gift-giving was limited. Cards were not yet exchanged. The Christmas tree, that beloved symbol of the season, had not yet taken root in British soil. Across the Channel, however, things were different. In the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, the Christmas tree had been a cherished tradition for centuries. German families brought small evergreen trees into their homes each December, decorating them with candles, fruits, nuts, and small handmade ornaments. The practice dated back at least to the 16th century, and possibly earlier. Some historians trace it to medieval mystery plays, which used evergreen trees to represent the Garden of Eden. Others connect it to older pagan traditions honoring evergreen plants during the winter solstice, whatever its origins. By the early 1800s, the Christmas tree was firmly established in German culture, a symbol of light and life in the darkest time of year. The British, for the most part, knew nothing of this tradition. A few German immigrants had brought the custom with them, setting up trees in their own homes. The royal family itself had some exposure to the practice. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, had introduced a small decorated tree to the court in 1800. But these early examples remained curiosities, known only to a small circle. The Christmas tree had not yet captured the British imagination. That would require a different kind of influence, the power of a beloved young queen and her devoted German husband. In December 1848, the Illustrated London News published a special Christmas edition. Among its pages was an engraving that would transform British holiday traditions forever. The image showed Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and their children gathered around a decorated Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. The tree stood on a table, its branches laden with candles, small toys, sweets, and ornaments. Beneath it, gifts were arranged for the children. The royal family looked happy, united, the very picture of domestic bliss. The illustration was not entirely accurate. It was based on an earlier German print, modified to include the British royals, but accuracy mattered less than impact. The image struck a chord with the British public. Here was their beloved queen, the mother of the nation, celebrating Christmas in a way that seemed both novel and deeply appealing. The message was clear. This was how Christmas should be celebrated. This was how a proper family should gather. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Middle-class families across Britain rushed to imitate the royal example. If Queen Victoria had a Christmas tree, they would have won too. Merchants quickly responded to the demand, selling trees and decorations to eager customers. Newspapers published instructions on how to set up and decorate a tree. Within a few years, the Christmas tree had gone from a foreign curiosity to a standard feature of British Christmas celebrations. The trend was not limited to Britain. The illustration was reprinted in American magazines, reaching audiences across the Atlantic. German immigrants had already introduced the Christmas tree to parts of the United States, but the royal endorsement gave the tradition new prestige and wider appeal. By the 1850s and 1860s, Christmas trees were appearing in American homes from Boston to San Francisco. The power of the image lay partly in what it represented. Victoria and Albert were not just monarchs, they were symbols of a new ideal of family life. Unlike previous generations of royalty, known for their scandals and distant parenting, Victoria and Albert presented themselves as devoted spouses and loving parents. Their Christmas tree was part of this image, a symbol of warmth, togetherness, and domestic virtue. To have a tree was to embrace these values, to create a home that echoed the happiness of the royal household. As the Christmas tree spread across Britain and beyond, its decorations evolved. The earliest trees, like those in German tradition, were adorned with simple items: candles for light, fruits and nuts for color, homemade ornaments crafted from paper and fabric. These decorations were modest but meaningful, each one representing time and care invested by family members. The candles, while beautiful, posed obvious dangers. Open flames on dry evergreen branches led to countless household fires each December. Families kept buckets of water or sand nearby, ready to douse any flames. Despite these precautions, accidents were common. The warmth and beauty of the candlelit tree came with genuine risk. German glassblowers, particularly those in the town of began producing glass ornaments in the mid-19th century. These delicate baubles, blown and painted by hand, added a new dimension of beauty to the Christmas tree. They caught and reflected the candlelight, creating a shimmering effect that captivated viewers. The ornaments were expensive at first, available only to wealthy families. But as production increased, prices fell, and glass baubles became accessible to households of more modest means. The late 19th century brought further innovations. Tinsel, originally made from thin strips of real silver, added sparkle to the branches. Paper decorations became more elaborate. Manufactured ornaments in the shapes of angels, stars, and Santas appeared in shops. The Christmas tree became an opportunity for display, a chance to show off both taste and prosperity. The most significant change came in 1882, when Edward H. Johnson, a colleague of Thomas Edison, created the first electrically lit Christmas tree. Johnson hand-wired 80 small bulbs and wrapped them around a tree in his New York home. The effect was sensational. Electric lights were safer than candles, brighter and more reliable. They transformed the tree from a fire hazard into a dazzling spectacle. Electric Christmas lights spread slowly. At first they were expensive and required access to electrical power, which many homes lacked. But by the early 20th century, they had become increasingly common. Today, electric lights are so standard that few people remember the candles that came before, or the risks that families once accepted for the sake of that soft, flickering glow. The Christmas tree that Albert introduced to Windsor Castle has traveled far beyond those palace walls. Today, decorated evergreens appear in homes, town squares, and public spaces around the world. The tradition has spread to countries that Albert never visited, embraced by cultures he never knew. In Tokyo and Sydney, in Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town, Christmas trees glow, each December descendant, in a sense, of that first royal tree. Certain trees have become famous in their own right. The tree at Rockefeller Center in New York, first erected in 1931, draws millions of visitors each year. The tree in London's Trafalgar Square, a gift from Norway since 1947, commemorates British support during World War II. The national Christmas tree on the White House lawn, the Vatican Christmas tree in St. Peter's Square, the trees that appear in shopping malls and airports and living rooms everywhere. All of them trace their lineage, however distantly, to a German tradition that one prince carried to England nearly 2 centuries ago. What began as a private family custom became a global phenomenon, one of the most recognized symbols of the holiday season. And yet, at its heart, the Christmas tree remains what it was in Albert's childhood, a symbol of light in darkness, of hope in winter, of family gathered together to celebrate. The ornaments may change, the lights may evolve, but the meaning endures. While Albert was decorating trees at Windsor Castle, an ocean away, a very different Christmas story was unfolding. It had nothing to do with trees or decorations, nothing to do with comfort or celebration. It was a story of ice and desperation, of a general and an army with their backs against the wall, gambling everything on one frozen night. The winter of 1776 was one of the darkest moments in American history. The Revolutionary War, which had begun with such hope and defiance the previous year, was going terribly wrong. George Washington's Continental Army had been beaten again and again. The dream of independence, so boldly declared just months earlier, seemed to be slipping away. In July, the Declaration of Independence had announced to the world that the American colonies were free. The words were stirring, the principles noble, but words alone could not win a war. The British Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, was determined to crush the rebellion. Bilate Sumer Amasse Bridi, fleet had arrived in New York Harbor, carrying thousands of professional soldiers and German mercenaries known as Hesh. Washington's army, made up largely of farmers and tradesmen with little military training, was badly outmatched. The battles that followed were disasters. In August, the British routed Washington's forces at the Battle of Long Island. The Americans were forced to retreat across the East River to Manhattan, then northward, then across the Hudson River into New Jersey. Each week brought new defeats, new retreats, new losses. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds. Supplies ran desperately low. The army that had numbered over 20,000 men in the summer had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 by December. The mood in the colonies was grim. Many who had supported independence now doubted it would ever be achieved. Some began to quietly make peace with the idea of British rule. Even members of the Continental Congress, the governing body that had declared independence, seemed to lose faith. They fled Philadelphia as British forces approached, relocating to Baltimore. Washington himself struggled to maintain hope. In private letters, he confessed his despair. The army was melting away. Enlistments were set to expire at the end of December. In just days, most of his remaining soldiers would be free to go home, and many surely would. Without a victory, without some reason for hope, the revolution might simply end. Not with a dramatic defeat, but with a quiet dissolution. As the army walked away and the dream died, something had to change. Washington needed a victory, however small. He needed to show his soldiers, his countrymen, and perhaps himself that the cause was not yet lost. Across the Delaware River from Washington's camp lay the town of Trenton, New Jersey. A force of roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers was garrisoned there. Part of the British Army's occupation of the region, the Hessians were professional soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped, hired by the British Crown to help suppress the rebellion. They had a fearsome reputation on the battlefield. Washington studied the situation carefully. His spies brought reports about the Hessian garrison, their numbers, their routines, their defenses. One piece of intelligence stood out. The Hessians would likely celebrate Christmas with drinking and festivities. Their guard might be lowered. A surprise attack, if it could be achieved, might catch them unprepared. The plan was audacious, perhaps reckless. Washington would lead his army across the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through the darkness, and attack Trenton at dawn on December 26th. The river was choked with ice. The weather was brutal. The roads were poor. Everything would have to go perfectly for the attack to succeed. And if it failed, the army and the revolution would likely be finished. Washington shared his plan with his officers. Some were skeptical, but most recognized that the situation demanded bold action. Doing nothing meant certain defeat. At least this way, there was a chance. The password for the operation was fitting: victory or death. On the evening of December 25th, 1776, as darkness fell over the frozen landscape, Washington's army began to move. Approximately 2,400 soldiers marched to the riverbank, where a fleet of large Durham boats waited to carry them across. The boats were sturdy vessels, normally used to transport iron ore and other heavy cargo along the river. They would need every bit of that sturdiness in the hours ahead. The crossing began around 6 in the evening, but it quickly fell behind schedule. The river was treacherous. Large chunks of ice floated in the dark water, grinding against the boats and threatening to capsize them. A freezing rain began to fall, mixed with sleet and snow. The soldiers, many of whom lacked proper winter clothing, suffered terribly from the cold. Some had no shoes, wrapping their feet in rags that left bloody prints on the frozen ground. The men who rowed the boats were mostly fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, experienced mariners who knew how to handle vessels in dangerous conditions. They worked through the night, ferrying load after load of soldiers, horses, and artillery across the icy river. Without their skill and endurance, the crossing would have been impossible. Washington himself crossed early and waited on the New Jersey shore as his army slowly assembled. Hours passed. The original plan called for the attack to begin before dawn, catching the Hessians asleep. But the delays mounted. Midnight came and went. By the time the last soldiers were across, it was nearly 4 in the morning. Dawn would come before they reached Trenton. A lesser commander might have called off the attack. The element of surprise seemed lost. The men were exhausted, frozen, and hungry. But Washington pressed on. They had come too far to turn back now. The army formed into 2 columns and began the 9-mile march to Trenton. The march was agony. The roads were sheets of ice. The sleet continued to fall. Soldiers slipped and stumbled in the darkness. Some collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried by their comrades. But they kept moving, driven by desperation and the knowledge that everything depended on what happened next. As they marched, Washington rode among them, offering encouragement. At one point, a soldier slipped on the ice near the general's horse. Washington reportedly looked down and said simply, "Soldier, keep by your officer." It was not a dramatic speech, not a stirring call to arms, but it was enough. The army kept moving. The 2 American columns reached the outskirts of Trenton just after 8 in the morning on December 26th. The sun had risen, but visibility remained poor due to the continuing storm. The Hessians had posted sentries, but the weather had made them careless. When the first shots rang out, confusion swept through the town. The attack came from 2 directions simultaneously. American artillery opened fire on the main streets, preventing the Hessians from forming organized resistance. Soldiers poured into the town from multiple entry points. The Hessians, many still groggy from the previous night's celebrations, scrambled to respond. Some tried to form battle lines but were cut down by cannon fire. Others fled into houses and cellars. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Raul, attempted to rally his men. He was shot from his horse and mortally wounded. Without leadership, Hessian resistance crumbled. Within 90 minutes, the battle was over. The results were extraordinary. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers were captured, along with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Another 22 Hessians were killed and 83 wounded. American casualties were minimal. 2 soldiers had frozen to death during the march, and a handful were wounded in the fighting. Not a single American was killed in battle. Washington had his victory. The Battle of Trenton was, in purely military terms, a small engagement. It did not end the war or drive the British from America. It did not destroy the enemy's main army or capture any major city. By the standards of great battles, it was almost insignificant. But its impact was enormous. News of the victory spread quickly through the colonies. After months of defeat and despair, Americans finally had something to celebrate. The British could be beaten. The Hessians, those fearsome mercenaries, could be captured and humbled. The war was not lost after all. Within days, soldiers who had been preparing to go home changed their minds, and new volunteers stepped forward to join the fight. The Continental Congress regained confidence. Financial supporters, both domestic and foreign, renewed their commitments. The army that had seemed on the verge of dissolution found new life. Washington followed the Trenton victory with another successful engagement at Princeton just days later. The momentum of the war had shifted. Though years of fighting still lay ahead, the darkest moment had passed. The revolution would continue, and ultimately, it would succeed. The crossing of the Delaware became one of the most celebrated events in American history. Decades later, the painter Emanuel Leutz created a famous image of Washington standing in the bow of a boat, crossing the icy river. The painting contains historical inaccuracies. The flag shown was not yet in use. The boats are the wrong type, and Washington's dramatic pose would have been impractical in rough water. But the painting captured something true about the spirit of that night. The courage, the determination, the willingness to risk everything when everything was at stake. Each Christmas, the crossing is reenacted at Washington Crossing Historic Park, where visitors gather to watch actors in period costume row across the Delaware. It is a reminder that Christmas has sometimes been a time not for rest, but for dating, a moment when history turned because ordinary people did extraordinary things. Nearly 2 centuries after Washington's frozen gamble, another group of Americans would spend Christmas far from home. They, too, were on a journey into the unknown, facing dangers that few could fully understand. But their destination was not a town in New Jersey. It was the moon itself. The year 1968 had been one of the most difficult in American memory. It seemed as though the fabric of the nation was tearing apart, thread by thread, month by month. The Vietnam War continued to rage, claiming thousands of lives and dividing the country into bitter factions. In January, the Tet Offensive shattered the government's claims that victory was near, as communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. The images broadcast into American living rooms showed chaos, destruction, and a war that seemed to have no end. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The civil rights leader, who had preached nonviolence and dreamed of racial harmony, was shot on the balcony of his motel. His death sparked riots in cities across the country. Fires burned in Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, and dozens of other places. The grief was overwhelming, the rage understandable, the damage profound. Just 2 months later, in June, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. The senator and presidential candidate, who had offered hope to many Americans weary of war and division, was shot moments after winning the California primary. 2 beloved leaders, gone within weeks of each other. The sense of loss was staggering. Summer brought further unrest. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into violence as police clashed with anti-war protesters in the streets. Television cameras captured the chaos. Young people beaten with batons, tear gas drifting through the air. Chants of the whole world is watching. The images seemed to confirm what many feared. The country was coming apart. By December, Americans were exhausted. The year had demanded too much, taken too much, broken too much. People longed for something to restore their faith in their country, in humanity, in the future. They did not know it yet, but that something was already on its way. carried by 3 men in a spacecraft heading toward the moon. The Apollo program had been racing against time. President John F. Kennedy had declared in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended. Now, with only 1 year remaining, that goal seemed almost impossible. The program had suffered terrible setbacks, including the Apollo 1 fire in 1967 that killed 3 astronauts during a launchpad test. Engineers worked frantically to solve problems, to test systems, to prepare for the ultimate challenge. Apollo 8 was originally planned as a relatively modest mission, a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit. But delays in the lunar module's development, combined with intelligence that the Soviet Union might be planning its own lunar mission, led NASA to make a bold decision. Apollo 8 would be the first crewed spacecraft to leave Earth's orbit and travel to the moon. There would be no lunar module, no landing. The 3 astronauts would simply orbit the moon and return home. It would be a demonstration of American capability, a crucial step toward the eventual landing, and an enormous risk. The crew consisted of 3 experienced astronauts. Frank Borman, the commander, was a disciplined Air Force colonel who had already flown in space aboard Gemini 7. James Luke, the command module pilot, was a Navy captain and skilled navigator who would later command the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission. William Anders, the lunar module pilot, was making his first space, though his role would focus on photography and observation since there was no lunar module to pilot. On December 21, 1968, the massive Saturn V rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The launch was flawless. The spacecraft, named Columbia, accelerated away from Earth, carrying its 3 passengers toward a destination no human being had ever approached. For the first time in history, people were leaving the gravitational embrace of their home planet and venturing into deep space. The journey to the moon took approximately 3 days. The astronauts monitored their systems, made course corrections, and watched through their windows as the Earth grew smaller and smaller behind them. They were farther from home than any human beings had ever been, traveling through a void that offered no rescue if something went wrong. The isolation was profound. The responsibility was immense. And yet, they pressed on. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 reached the moon. The spacecraft fired its engine to slow down, allowing lunar gravity to capture it. For the first time, human beings were orbiting another world. Below them, the lunar surface stretched in stark, barren beauty, craters and mountains, gray dust and ancient rock. It was magnificent and desolate, utterly unlike anything on Earth. The astronauts orbited the moon 10 times, photographing the surface and scouting potential landing sites for future missions. They described what they saw in technical terms, transmitting data back to mission control. But they also experienced something that no amount of training had prepared them for the sight of Earth from 250,000 miles away. It happened during their 4th orbit. The spacecraft came around the far side of the moon, and suddenly, rising above the lunar horizon, was Earth, a small blue and white marble suspended in the blackness of space. Delicate, beautiful, alone. William Anders saw it first. "Oh my God, look at that picture over there," he said. "There's the Earth, coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" The astronauts scrambled for cameras. Anders took a photograph, a color image of the blue Earth, rising above the gray lunar surface, set against the infinite black of space. The photo would later be called Earthrise, and it would become one of the most influential images ever captured. The astronauts were profoundly moved by what they saw. The Earth, which seemed so large and permanent when you lived upon it, appeared fragile from this distance. The borders between nations were invisible. The conflicts that divided humanity seemed meaningless against the vastness of the cosmos. There was only one Earth, one home, shared by all. Frank Borman later described the experience. "The vast loneliness is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth." Jim Lovell put it more simply. "The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space." In that moment, something shifted in human consciousness. The astronauts had gone to explore the moon, but what they discovered was the preciousness of Earth. That evening, on Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 conducted a live television broadcast from lunar orbit. It was the most watched broadcast in history up to that time. Approximately 1 billion people Nearly 1/4 of the world's population tuned in to see and hear what the astronauts had to share. The broadcast began with the astronauts describing the lunar surface as they passed over it. They pointed their camera at the craters and mountains below, narrating what they observed. The images were grainy and black and white, but they were extraordinary. Live television from the moon, beamed across the void to living rooms and public squares around the world. Then, as the broadcast neared its conclusion, something unexpected happened. The astronauts had been asked to say something appropriate for the occasion, something that would resonate with the enormous audience watching from Earth. NASA had not specified what that should be. The choice was left to the crew. William Anders spoke first. "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," he read, "and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." Jim Lovell continued, reading the next verses from the book of Genesis. Then Frank Borman read the final passage, concluding with the words, "And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good." Borman then offered a closing message, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." The broadcast ended. Across the planet, people sat in silence, moved by what they had witnessed. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared at their televisions, trying to comprehend what they had just experienced. After a year of assassinations and riots, of war and division, here was something different. A moment of unity, of wonder, of peace. The choice to read from Genesis was not without controversy. One prominent atheist, Madeleine Murray O'Hair, later filed a lawsuit against NASA, arguing that the reading violated the separation of church and state. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but it highlighted the tensions inherent in such a public expression of faith. For many, however, the reading felt appropriate. Ancient words spoken from a place no human had ever been, connecting the vastness of creation to the small blue planet watching from below. On Christmas Day, the astronauts fired their engine to leave lunar orbit and begin the journey home. The burn had to be perfect too long, and they would miss Earth entirely. Too short, and they would not have enough velocity to escape the moon's gravity. The engine fired precisely as planned, and Apollo 8 began its 3-day voyage back to Earth. On December 27th, the spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts were recovered safely by the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. They returned to a hero's welcome parades, awards, the gratitude of a nation, and a world that had desperately needed something to celebrate. Time magazine named the Apollo 8 crew its Men of the Year for 1968. The photograph of Earthrise was published around the world, eventually becoming a symbol of the environmental movement and a reminder of the planet's fragility. The mission paved the way for Apollo 11, which would land astronauts on the lunar surface just 7 months later, fulfilling President Kennedy's challenge with months to spare. But beyond the technical achievements, Apollo 8 gave humanity something equally valuable: a new perspective. The astronauts had traveled to the moon and discovered Earth. They had looked back at their home from a distance no human had ever achieved and seen it as it truly was. A small, precious world floating in the darkness, the only home we have. That Christmas Eve broadcast, with its ancient words and its message of peace, became a touchstone for a troubled year. It reminded people that even in the darkest times, wonder is still possible. It offered not an escape from Earth's problems, but a reason to cherish the planet and its people. And it joined the other Christmas stories we have explored: the truce, the song, the tree, the crossing, as a moment when the holiday revealed something profound about human nature and human hope. Every story that survives across generations undergoes a transformation. Details shift. Emphasis changes. Some elements are amplified while others fade into obscurity. This is especially true of Christmas stories, which carry such emotional weight that they naturally attract embellishment and idealization. The 5 stories we have explored are no exception. Each one has been examined by historians, debated by scholars, and sometimes challenged by evidence that complicates the simpler versions we prefer to tell. This does not diminish these stories. Understanding what historians have learned about them, the questions that remain unanswered, the myths that have grown around the facts, actually deepens their meaning. It reminds us that history is not a fixed thing, but an ongoing conversation between past and present. The stories we tell reveal as much about ourselves as they do about the events they describe. In the sections that follow, we will examine each of our 5 Christmas stories through a more analytical lens. We will explore what historians agree upon, where they disagree, and what questions may never be fully answered. The goal is not to diminish the wonder of these events, but to appreciate them more fully, as complex human moments, rather than simple fables. The Christmas truce of 1914 has become one of the most celebrated moments of the First World War. It appears in films, songs, and countless retellings. The image of enemies meeting in no man's land, exchanging gifts and playing football, has become a powerful symbol of shared humanity. But how accurate is this image? How widespread was the truce really? Historians generally agree that something remarkable did happen along portions of the Western Front on Christmas 1914. Letters and diaries from British, German, and French soldiers confirm that informal ceasefires occurred in multiple locations. Soldiers did climb out of their trenches. They did meet their enemies in no man's land. They did exchange small gifts and, in some cases, help bury the dead. These basic facts are well documented. However, the truce was not universal. It did not occur along the entire front. In many sectors, fighting continued as usual, with artillery barrages and sniper fire claiming lives on Christmas Day. Just as on any other, the truces that did occur were localized, spontaneous, and varied greatly in their character. In some places, the ceasefire lasted only a few hours. In others, it extended for several days. Some truces involved elaborate fraternization. Others consisted merely of an agreement not to shoot. The famous football matches present a particular challenge for historians. Numerous accounts mention games being played in no man's land, but concrete evidence is limited. A few letters describe informal kickabouts with improvised balls. Others mention only that someone produced a football, without confirming that a real match took place. Some historians believe that full-scale games did occur in at least a few locations. Others suggest that the football story has been exaggerated over time, growing from brief, chaotic play into organized machines with goals and scores. What is clear is that the military authorities were deeply troubled by the truces. Commanders worried that fraternization would undermine soldiers' willingness to fight. Orders were issued to prevent any recurrence. In subsequent years, artillery bombardments were deliberately scheduled for the Christmas period to make truces impossible. The spontaneous humanity of 1914 was never repeated on the same scale. The Christmas truce has also been shaped by how it has been remembered or forgotten over time. In the immediate aftermath, the truces received some press coverage, but they were often downplayed by military censors and officials. It was only decades later, as the last veterans aged and the war receded into history, that the truce was rediscovered and elevated into a symbol of peace. The story we tell today reflects both what happened in 1914 and what later generations wanted to believe about Italien. The story of Silent Night seems straightforward: a broken organ, a resourceful priest, a simple melody composed on Christmas Eve. But even this beloved tale contains uncertainties that historians have debated for nearly 2 centuries. The basic facts are not in dispute. Joseph Moore did write the poem Still Nacht. Franz Xaver Gruber did compose the melody. The song was performed at St. Nicholas Church in Auburn. Gruber himself documented the song's creation in a letter written in 1854, decades after the event. His account has been the primary source for most However, some details remain unclear. The exact reason the organ broke has never been definitively established. The story about mice chewing through the bellows is colorful, but may be apocryphal. Other explanations, rust, flood damage, general disrepair, have been proposed. The truth is that no contemporary account explains what was wrong with the organ. The story of the mice may have been added later to make the tale more vivid. There is also uncertainty about when Moore wrote the poem. Gruber's account states that Moore brought him a poem that had already been written, suggesting it was composed before December 1818. Some scholars believe Moore wrote the poem in 1816, while serving at a different parish. Others place its composition earlier or later. The exact circumstances that inspired Moore to write about the Salien, Holy Night, remain unknown. For many years, the song's authorship was mystery. As Silent Night spread across Europe, it was sometimes credited to more famous composers, Haydn, Mozart, even Beethoven. The modest origins of the song, created by two unknown men in a small village, seemed implausible to some who heard its beauty. Gruber, S. 1854. Letter was partly an effort to set the record straight and ensure that he and Moore received proper credit. The song's simplicity has been both praised and analyzed. Musicologists note that the melody is unusually gentle and making it easy for untrained voices to sing. This accessibility may explain much of its enduring popularity. Unlike more complex hymns that require skill to perform, Silent Night can be sung by anyone, anywhere. Its simplicity is not a limitation, but a strength, allowing it to cross cultural and linguistic boundaries with ease. Today, Oberndorf has embraced its connection to the song. The Silent Night Chapel stands near the site of the original church, which was demolished due to flooding in the early 20th century. Visitors come from around the world to see where the song was born, yet even this commemoration involves some uncertainty. The exact location of the original church has been debated, and the chapel is an approximation rather than a precise reconstruction. The story of Queen Victoria's Christmas tree presents a clear narrative. Prince Albert brought a German tradition to England. A newspaper illustration made it famous, and the rest of the world followed. This account is largely accurate, but it simplifies a more complex process of cultural transmission and invention. Christmas trees existed in Britain before Albert. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, introduced a tree to the royal court in 1800. German immigrants had been setting up trees in their homes for years. The tradition was not entirely unknown. It was simply uncommon and associated with foreigners. What Albert and Victoria did was make the Christmas tree fashionable. Their adoption of the tradition, combined with the 1848 illustration in the Illustrated London News, gave the tree a royal endorsement that transformed it from a curiosity into a social aspiration. Middle-class families, eager to emulate the domestic ideals the royal couple represented, rushed to adopt the custom. This process illustrates what historian Eric Hobsbawm called the invention of tradition. Many customs that seem ancient and timeless are actually relatively recent, created or popularized in specific historical circumstances. The Christmas tree, though it had genuine roots in German folk practice, became a widespread British and American tradition, largely through the mechanisms of Victorian media and consumer culture. Newspapers spread the image. Merchants sold the trees and ornaments. The tradition was not simply inherited, it was actively constructed. The Christmas tree also underwent significant changes as it spread. German trees were typically small, placed on tables, and decorated with modest items: candles, fruits, nuts, and homemade ornaments. Over time, trees grew larger, eventually becoming the floor-standing giants we know today. Decorations became more elaborate and commercially produced. The transition from candles to electric lights fundamentally changed the tree's appearance and the experience of gathering around it. Some scholars have noted the irony of a tradition so closely associated with Christianity having roots in pre-Christian winter celebrations. Evergreen plants held symbolic significance in many ancient cultures, representing life and hope during the darkest time of year. The Christmas tree may represent a Christian adaptation of older practices, a blending of traditions that occurred gradually over centuries. This does not diminish the tree's meaning, but it does complicate simple narratives about its origins. The story of Washington crossing the Delaware has been told and retold so many times that separating fact from legend requires careful attention. The basic events are well documented. Washington did lead his army across the river on Christmas night. The attack on Trenton did succeed. The victory did have an enormous psychological impact. But the way this story has been portrayed, particularly in art and popular culture, often departs significantly from historical reality. The most famous representation of the crossing is Emanuel Lewitz's 1851 painting, which shows Washington standing heroically in the bow of a boat, crossing the ice-choked river. The painting is dramatic and inspiring. It is also full of inaccuracies. The flag shown in the painting, the Stars and Stripes, did not exist in December 1776. It was not adopted until June 1777. The boats depicted resemble small rowboats, quite different from the large Durham boats actually used. Washington's dramatic standing pose would have been impractical and dangerous in the rough, icy conditions of the actual crossing. Leutz painted the scene not to document history but to inspire it. He was a German-American artist, working in the revolutionary atmosphere of mid-19th century Europe, and he intended the painting to evoke the spirit of liberty and resistance to tyranny. Historical accuracy was less important than emotional impact. The painting succeeded brilliantly on its own terms, becoming one of the most recognized images in American history. But it has also shaped how people imagine the crossing in ways that depart from the reality. Modern historians have also emphasized aspects of the story that earlier accounts overlooked. The crucial role of the Marblehead mariners, the fishermen, and sailors who actually rowed the boats, received little attention in traditional retellings focused on Washington's leadership. Recent scholarship has highlighted the contributions of these ordinary men, many of whom were Black or Native American, who made the crossing possible through their skill and endurance. The element of surprise has also been reconsidered. Traditional accounts emphasize that the Hessians were caught off guard because they were sleeping off their Christmas celebrations. While there is some truth to this, the reality is more complex. The Hessians had received intelligence that an attack might be coming, but poor weather and the assumption that no one would attempt a river crossing in such conditions led them to lower their guard. The success of the attack owed as much to the Hessians' reasonable miscalculation as to Washington's daring. None of this diminishes the achievement. The crossing was genuinely dangerous, the attack genuinely bold, the victory genuinely important. But understanding the full complexity of the event, including the contributions of ordinary soldiers, and the role of luck and circumstance, provides a richer picture than the simplified heroic narrative. The Apollo 8 Christmas Eve broadcast remains one of the most memorable moments in the history of space exploration, but it also generated controversy that continues to resonate, touching on fundamental questions about the relationship between religion and publicly funded science. The astronauts' decision to read from the Book of Genesis was not a NASA directive. The agency had asked the crew to say something appropriate for the occasion, but left the specific content to their discretion. Frank Borman later explained that they wanted to say something that would be meaningful to the largest possible audience. The opening verses of Genesis, describing the creation of the heavens and the earth, seemed fitting for a broadcast from lunar orbit. The passage was familiar to people of many faiths and carried no specifically sectarian message. Not everyone agreed with this assessment. Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the founder of American Atheists and a prominent advocate for the separation of church and state, filed a lawsuit against NASA following the broadcast. O'Hair argued that the reading constituted a government endorsement of religion, violating the First Amendment of the Constitution. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed by the courts, which declined to intervene in such matters. But the controversy highlighted tensions that persist to this day. Supporters of the reading argue that the astronauts were exercising their personal religious freedom, not imposing religion on anyone. They note that the passage from Genesis was chosen for its literary and cultural significance, not as an act of critics counter that astronauts speaking in their official capacity on a government-funded mission inevitably carry the weight of governmental authority. The broadcast was not a private devotional act, but a public message to the world. The controversy has influenced subsequent space missions. When Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin took communion on the lunar surface, he did so privately, without broadcasting the act. NASA has generally sought to avoid religious content in official communications, though individual astronauts' personal beliefs inevitably shape their experiences and their reflections on them. Beyond the religious dimensions, the Apollo 8 broadcast raised questions about how humanity should present itself to the cosmos. If the message was intended for the largest possible audience, did it truly represent that audience? The reading from Genesis reflected one cultural tradition, specifically the Judeo-Christian heritage of the Western world. Other traditions, other scriptures, other ways of understanding creation were not included. Some have argued that a truly universal message would have drawn from multiple sources, or focused on shared human values rather than any particular religious text. These debates, though important, should not obscure what the broadcast achieved. For millions of viewers in December 1968, the message from Apollo 8 provided a moment of peace and wonder in a year of turmoil. The ancient words, spoken from so far away, connected human beings to something larger than their immediate struggles. Whether one views the reading as appropriate or problematic, its emotional impact was undeniable. Examining these 5 stories through a critical lens reveals a common pattern. Each has been shaped not only by what happened, but by how later generations chose to remember and retell the events. The Christmas truce has grown from a localized phenomenon into a universal symbol of peace. Silent Night has acquired a romantic origin story that may simplify a more mundane reality. The Christmas tree has been transformed from a foreign curiosity into a seemingly timeless tradition. Washington's Crossing has been romanticized through art and storytelling. Apollo 8's broadcast has been celebrated and contested in equal measure. This process of mythalization is not necessarily a distortion. Myths serve important functions in human culture. They provide shared narratives that bind communities together. They offer models of behavior and sources of inspiration. They help us make sense of the past and orient ourselves toward the future. The Christmas stories we have examined perform all of these functions, even if, or perhaps, because they have been polished and simplified over time. What remains constant across all 5 stories is the human need to find meaning in the darkness. Christmas falls at the darkest time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, when the days are shortest and the nights longest. It is a natural moment for reflection, for gathering, for seeking light. The stories that attach themselves to Christmas reflect this need. They are stories of hope emerging from despair, of connection forming across division, of small acts rippling outward into history. Understanding the complexities and controversies surrounding these stories does not diminish them. If anything, it makes them more human, more real, more connected to the messy, uncertain, wonderful experience of being alive. The soldiers in the trenches, the priest with his guitar, the queen with her tree, the general on the riverbank. The astronauts in lunar orbit all were human beings, with human limitations and human hopes. Their stories endure not because they were perfect, but because they remind us of what we are capable of becoming. There is something about Christmas that makes time feel different. The ordinary rhythms of life seem to slow, even stop, as the holiday approaches. Work pauses. Schools close. The usual urgencies that drive our days suddenly seem less pressing. We gather with family. We light candles. We share meals. For a brief moment, the world seems to hold its breath. This pause is not accidental. It is woven into the very fabric of the holiday, reaching back through centuries of human experience. Long before Christmas was celebrated as we know it, people marked the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year. They built fires against the darkness. They gathered together for warmth. They waited for the sun to return. The pause was not merely a choice. It was a necessity, a response to the natural world and its cycles. The stories we have explored all share this quality of existing in a paused moment. The soldiers in the trenches stopped fighting, if only for a day. The war did not end, but for those few hours, it did not exist. The priest in Oberndorf faced a silent church and chose to fill it with music, creating a moment of beauty in an otherwise difficult time. Washington paused on the frozen riverbank, gathering his courage before plunging into the unknown. The astronauts of Apollo 8 paused in lunar orbit, looking back at Earth and seeing it as no human ever had before. In AH's case, the pause made space for something extraordinary to happen. When the normal rules were suspended, new possibilities emerged. Enemies became friends. A simple poem became an immortal song. A desperate gamble became a turning point. A technological achievement became a spiritual experience. Perhaps this is why we continue to observe Christmas, even as the specific religious meanings have faded for many people. The pause itself has value. In a world that moves ever faster, that demands our attention constantly, that fills every moment with noise and activity, the invitation to stop is precious. Christmas gives us permission to step out of ordinary time and enter something different. A space where reflection is possible, where connection is prioritized, where the small and tender things that usually get overlooked can finally receive our attention. The darkness of winter, which once threatened survival, now offers a gift. It invites us inward. It reminds us that rest is not weakness, but necessity. It teaches us that even the longest night will end, and the light will return. Each of the stories we have explored contains an element of hope. The soldiers who climbed out of the trenches hoped for peace, even if they could not articulate it. The priest who picked up his guitar hoped that music would lift his congregation's spirits. Washington hoped that a desperate gamble would save his army and his cause. The astronauts hoped that their mission would succeed and that their message would reach a troubled world. Hope is sometimes dismissed as naivety, a refusal to accept harsh realities, a form of wishful thinking, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Hope is not a denial of difficulty. It is a response to it. The soldiers knew the war would resume. Moore knew his village faced hard times. Washington knew the odds were against him. The astronauts knew the risks of their mission. Their hope did not blind them to these realities. It enabled them to act. Despite them, psychologists who study resilience have found that hope is one of the strongest predictors of survival in difficult circumstances. People who maintain hope, not blind optimism, but a genuine belief that their actions can make a difference, are more likely to persevere through hardship. Hope is not a feeling that arrives unbidden. It is a discipline, a choice, a practice. It requires effort to maintain, especially when circumstances are dire. Christmas stories, with their consistent theme of light emerging from darkness, serve as vessels for this discipline. They remind us that hope has existed before, that it has been justified before, that the darkest moments have sometimes preceded the brightest outcomes. When we hear about the Christmas truce, we are reminded that even in the midst of terrible war, humanity's better instincts can emerge. When we hear about Washington's crossing, we are reminded that desperation can be transformed into triumph. These stories do not promise that everything will always work out, but they do suggest that giving up is not the only option. There's also something hopeful about the survival of these stories themselves. They have crossed oceans and centuries, passed from person to person, translated into countless languages. The fact that we still tell them, still find meaning in them, is itself a form of hope. It suggests that goodness is memorable, that acts of courage and kindness leave traces that persist long after the individuals who performed them are gone. Hope is not certainty. The soldiers who met in no man's land could not know if the war would ever end. Moore could not know if his song would survive. Washington could not know if his country would succeed. The astronauts could not know if humanity would learn the lessons their photographs suggested. But they acted anyway. They hoped anyway. And because they did, we have these stories to tell. None of the events we have described seem particularly significant at the moment they occurred. A group of soldiers singing carols in a trench. A priest composing a melody for guitar. A family portrait published in a newspaper. An army crossing a river. A broadcast from space. In the immediate context, each seemed like a small thing, a personal gesture, a practical solution, an ordinary moment in an extraordinary setting. It is only in hindsight that we recognize their significance. The Christmas truce was initially suppressed by military authorities, treated as an embarrassment rather than an inspiration. Silent Night spread slowly, taking decades to reach global audiences. The impact of Victoria's Christmas tree was not immediately apparent. The tradition grew gradually, year by year, family by family. Washington's crossing, though celebrated afterward, was a desperate act that might easily have failed. The Apollo 8 broadcast was moving in the moment, but its lasting significance, including the influence of the Earthrise photograph, only became clear over time. This pattern offers a quiet lesson. We rarely know, in the moment, which of our actions will matter. The soldier who first climbed out of his trench had no idea he was participating in one of history's most remembered events. Moore did not know he was writing a song that would be sung for centuries. Washington did not know he was creating an image that would define American identity. Anders did not know he was taking one of the most important photographs ever made. This uncertainty can be unsettling. We want to know that our actions matter, that our efforts have meaning. But it can also be liberating. If we cannot predict which moments will prove significant, then perhaps all moments deserve our attention. Perhaps the small kindnesses, the quiet acts of creativity, the moments of courage that seem to achieve nothing, perhaps these, too, leave traces we cannot see. The people at the center of these Christmas stories were not trying to make history. They were simply responding to the circumstances before them, doing what seemed right or necessary in the moment. The soldier wanted peace, if only briefly. The priest wanted music for his congregation. The queen wanted to share her husband's traditions with her children. The general wanted to save his army. The astronauts wanted to say something meaningful to a watching world. Their intentions were modest. History made them legendary. There's something comforting in this. It suggests that meaning does not have to be pursued or manufactured. It emerges naturally from authentic engagement with life. By being fully present in our own small moments, we may be contributing to stories that will outlive us, though we will never know it. One of the most remarkable aspects of these Christmas stories is how they create connection across vast distances of space, of time, of circumstance. The Apollo 8 astronauts were farther from any other human beings than anyone had ever been. And yet, through their broadcast, they connected with 1 billion people on Earth. The distance was immense, but the connection was intimate. People in their living rooms felt they were sharing something with the astronauts, seeing what they saw, feeling what they felt. Technology bridged the void. Victoria's Christmas tree created a different kind of connection, not instantaneous, but gradual. Families who saw the illustration in the newspaper felt connected to the Queen and her household. They adopted her tradition, making it their own. And as the tradition spread, it connected countless families to each other. The tree in a home in Boston was linked, through invisible threads of cultural transmission, to the tree in Windsor Castle and the trees in German villages centuries before. The soldiers of the Christmas truce experienced connection at its most immediate and unlikely. Men who had been trying to kill each other discovered that they shared the same songs, the same longing for home, the same weariness with war. The distance between their trenches, 100 yards of mud and wire, was erased when they met in no man's land. For a few hours, they were not enemies, but fellow human beings. These connections remind us that distance, though real, is not absolute. We are linked to each other in ways that transcend physical separation. We share stories and traditions, songs and symbols. The same melody that Morin Gruber sang in 1818 is sung today by people who have never seen Austria. Never heard of Obendorf? Never thought about broken church organs? The song connects them, nonetheless, to that small village and that Christmas Eve. Christmas itself functions as a kind of connection across time. When we celebrate, we are participating in something that extends back through generations. Our grandparents celebrated Christmas, and their grandparents before them. We use the same words, sing the same songs, observe the same rituals. Through these practices, we touch the past and are touched by it. There's a reason you may be listening to these stories as the day ends and sleep approaches. Stories told at night have a different quality than stories told in daylight. They wrap around us like blankets. They soften the edges of the world. They prepare us to let go of waking consciousness and enter the realm of dreams. The stories we have shared tonight are particularly suited for this transition. They are gentle stories, even when they touch on difficult subjects like war and hardship. They end not in tragedy but in wonder. They offer not anxiety but reassurance. At the deepest level, what these stories offer is the comfort of continuity. They remind us that other people have faced dark winters and found light within them. Other people have felt afraid and acted with courage. Other people have been far from home and found connection. Other people have struggled and survived and left behind something beautiful. This knowledge does not solve our problems or answer our questions, but it does something equally valuable. It places us within a larger story, a human story that extends back through time and forward into a future we cannot see. We are not alone. We are not the first to face the darkness, and the darkness, as these stories remind us, does not last forever. As sleep approaches, let these stories settle into memory. Let the soldier singing in the trenches become a reminder of peace. Let the priest and his guitar become a reminder of creativity and constraint. Let the queen and her tree become a reminder of traditions that connect us. Let the general on the river become a reminder of courage in desperation. Let the astronauts and their Earthrise become a reminder of how small and precious our world truly is. These are your companions as the night grows deep. They have been told before to other listeners, in other years, in other places. They will be told again, long after we are gone. And in that telling and retelling, something endures, a light that passes from hand to hand through the darkness, never quite going out. We have traveled far tonight. We have walked through the frozen mud of no man's land, where enemies laid down their rifles and remembered what it meant to be human. We have sat in a small Austrian church, listening to the first notes of a song that would circle the world. We have stood in the candlelit drawing room of Windsor Castle, watching a German prince share his childhood memories with his English children. We have crossed an icy river in the dark of night, following a desperate general toward an uncertain dawn, and we have floated in the silence of space, looking back at our fragile blue home from 250,000 miles away. These 5 stories span nearly 200 years. They unfolded on different continents, in different circumstances, among people who never knew each other and never could have imagined the other's lives. The soldiers in the trenches did not know that the song they sang had been born from a broken organ. The astronauts reading Genesis did not think of Washington crossing a river on another Christmas long ago. Each story existed in its own moment, complete unto itself, and yet something connects them. It is not a single idea that can be easily named, nor a moral that can be neatly stated. It is more like a feeling, a sense that Christmas, whatever else it may be, opens a door that is usually closed. Through that door, possibilities emerge that would not exist at other times. Peace between enemies, music from silence, traditions from memory, victory from despair, wonder from the void. Perhaps this is the truest meaning of the holiday, not the theological doctrines or the commercial celebrations, but this simple opening, this willingness to pause, to hope, to reach across whatever distances separate us from one another. The soldiers reached across the war. Moore reached across the silence. Victoria and Albert reached across cultures. Washington reached across the frozen river. The astronauts reached across the emptiness of space. In each case, the reaching mattered more than the outcome. The gesture itself was the gift. When the candles burn low and the decorations are put away, what remains of Christmas? The presents are opened and forgotten. The meals are eaten and cleared. The songs fade into silence. The day passes like any other day, and ordinary life resumes. But something lingers. The stories we have shared tonight are proof of that. They have survived because they touched something that does not fade. Something in the human heart that responds to light and darkness, to kindness amid cruelty, to beauty born from difficulty. These stories have been told around countless fires, in countless languages, to countless children falling asleep on Christmas Eve. They will continue to be told long after we are gone. In this way, the past is never entirely past. When you hear Silent Night, you are connected to that small church in Ober, two more in Gruber, and the congregation that first heard their song. When you see a Christmas tree, you are connected to the forests of Germany, to the drawing rooms of Victorian England, to every family that has ever gathered around a decorated evergreen to exchange gifts and share warmth. When you hear about Washington's crossing, you are connected to those freezing soldiers who marched through the night because they believed in something worth suffering for. When you see the photograph of Earthrise, you are connected to the astronauts who looked back at our planet and saw it whole for the first time. These connections do not require belief or understanding. They simply exist, woven into the fabric of the traditions we observe and the stories we tell. Every Christmas carries within it echoes of all the Christmases that came before. We are participants in something larger than ourselves. A celebration that extends backward through centuries and forward into a future we cannot see. The tree in your window, if you have one, is part of this larger story. The songs you hear on the radio are a part of it. The meals you share, the gifts you give, the quiet moments when the house falls silent and you sit alone with your thoughts. All of these are threads in a tapestry that has been woven by countless hands over countless years. You did not create this tapestry, but you are adding to it in ways you may never fully understand. The hour grows late. The stories have been told. What remains now is the invitation to rest. Rest is not merely the absence of activity. It is a state of openness, of receptivity, of allowing the mind and body to settle into stillness. It is harder than it sounds. In a world that constantly demands our attention and fills our hours with noise. But it is necessary. Without rest, we cannot process what we have experienced or prepare for what is to come. Without rest, we cannot dream. The stories we have shared tonight are meant to accompany you into that stillness. They are not demanding stories. They do not require you to do anything or feel anything in particular. They simply offer themselves like gifts left under a tree, to be received or not as you choose. If you remember nothing else from these stories, Perhaps you will remember this, that even in the darkest times, human beings have found ways to create light. They've sung songs to their enemies. They have made music with whatever instruments were at hand. They have shared their traditions across borders and generations. They have risked everything for causes they believed in. They have looked at their world from impossible distances and seen its fragility and beauty. These are not superhuman acts. They were performed by ordinary people. Soldiers who wanted to go home. Priests who wanted to serve their congregations. Parents who wanted to give their children joy. Generals who wanted to save their countries. Astronauts who wanted to explore the unknown. Their ordinariness is precisely what makes their stories so powerful. If they could do these things, perhaps we can too. Perhaps we already do, in ways we do not recognize. Let us end where we began, with an image of Christmas, soft and still. Imagine snow falling on a quiet street. Imagine candlelight flickering in a window. Imagine voices singing a familiar melody, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Imagine a family gathered around a tree, their faces illuminated by small lights. Imagine soldiers laying down their weapons, if only for a night. Imagine a tiny church filled with the sound of a guitar. Imagine a boat pushing through ice in the darkness. Imagine Earth rising over the moon, blue and white and impossibly beautiful. These images belong to you now. They are part of your inheritance, passed down through time from people you will never meet, to people who will never know your name. They are gifts from the past to the present, and from the present to the future. Carry them with you as you close your eyes. Let them be your companions in the quiet hours. And when you wake, remember that somewhere, someone is always telling these stories. Somewhere a candle is always burning. Somewhere, even in the coldest and darkest times, there is always a little light. May your night be peaceful. May your dreams be gentle. And may the stories of Christmas past be a comfort to you, tonight and always. Thank you for spending this time with these stories, in the quiet of this hour. We have traveled together through centuries of Christmas history, from frozen battlefields to small village churches, from royal drawing rooms to icy rivers, from the silence of space back to the gentle glow of Earth. If these stories have brought you peace, perhaps you might share them with someone else who could use a restful listen. A friend who struggles to sleep. A family member who loves history. Someone who simply needs a reminder that the world has always held moments of unexpected beauty. We would love to hear from you as well. Do you have a favorite Christmas story from history? One that brings you comfort. One that fills you with wonder. Perhaps it is a story from your own family, passed down through generations. Perhaps it is something you read in a book or heard from a grandparent long ago. Whatever it may be, we invite you to share it in the comments below. Your stories become part of the larger tapestry, threads added to a pattern that stretches across time. If you enjoyed this journey, consider returning for more. There are always more stories to tell, more quiet corners of history to explore together. Until then, may your nights be restful, your dreams be kind, and your curiosity ever awake. Good night.